All right, so the recording has started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Annie Quinn. I'm the program manager at Three Rivers What Weather. I'm assuming that because of your involvement in today's meeting, that you know who we are. But it's always important at the end of the year, as we start to lose some of that mental capacity of carrying the load of our jobs and our lives and our health and our families over the course of a whole year, just remind you what we do and who we are. So Three Rivers What Weather, we have been incredibly active the last year in being the municipal facilitator for conversations, specifically around the phase 2 consent order agreements. As you know, I assume that a lot of you may be familiar with our region. Our regional sewer authority, Alkazan, who I'd also like to thank, is a supporter of the Green Infrastructure Network. They're the ones that give me the time and availability to host these meetings, as well as find speakers and develop the educational materials for you all through this network. But Alkazan, they have 83 municipalities involved in their network. And of those 83 municipalities, that includes the city of Pittsburgh, all of them right now have a very big decision ahead of them. That big decision is that over the course of 2 years, Three Rivers What Weather acted as a negotiating partner to determine and establish a new regulation that they will then have to follow to address stormwater, combined sewer overflows and separate sanitary issues. And so that includes I&I, and it also will include source reduction projects. And as we're always so hesitant to describe, source reduction really can be stormwater management. And so the connection between those two things is really where the GIN comes to play, is that right now, communities are about to sign a legal document. And that legal document that they'll be signing will give them a specific number of projects that they will all be required to do. And so we've talked a lot about the billions of dollars that Alkazan's about to spend on their big projects and updates to expand their plant. But I think it's really important for us to also acknowledge the possible billions of dollars those 82 other municipalities, and then who even knows how many billions of dollars the city of Pittsburgh will be actively spending over the next 5 years in order to address the water in our system, whether it's source water, whether it's groundwater, and get that out of sewer systems, whether that can be remediated in a combined sewer system, whether we can change percent capture. All of those things are going to be happening in the next 5 years. So we are on the precipice of one of the craziest times of our lives. And I think that that only adds to the momentum of the rest of the world also being kind of at a precipice of both the pandemic and other things. So I just want to acknowledge that. And that's really Three Rivers What Weather's role. We are the facilitator for not only the negotiations with the regulatory agencies, we're the nonprofit partner of Alkazan, and we really bring those communities together so that we're working for it as a region. So that's a little background. And also, since GIN sometimes doesn't overlap with that consent order agreement stuff, I just wanted to make sure everyone knows. Everybody should know, whether you live in that municipality and you're there as a resident, or you're just attending today, that those types of things are being approved and signed by your communities right now. And as an educated individual within this space, it will be our jobs to be the resources and the voices to help them decide how to move forward with what they do with that information. So back to GIN, right? So you're here for our Q4 meeting. Just to give you some updates of our year, we have spent the year having quarterly meetings. This was in June of 2020, I did a survey deciding and asking what the structure of GIN people would prefer it to be. And this was what came back as the strongest votes, that you would prefer it to be quarterly meetings. You would like it to be educational, and you would like there to be the opportunity for discussion and for us as a region to do a deep dive and get past we're not in the demonstration phase anymore, right? We're in the doing phase. And so while we're in the doing phase, what does that look like? And how can we be successful? And so this is the last quarter meeting of the year. You'll see us again in 2022, where we'll be hosting quarterly meetings with interesting and diverse speakers. I welcome anyone on this call. If you have something that you think might be a great fit for the Green Infrastructure Network, to please reach out to me. I would love to partner with you on possible topics as well as discussions. We've had incredibly different setups, whether we are doing breakout rooms and small group discussions, whether we were doing a panel of speakers, or we're doing a presentation today of survey results. All of those things have been a part of GIN, and I welcome you to tell me what might be something that you'd like to hear about. So please introduce yourself in the chat. Please give us your name, your organization, and if you're feeling up for it, the thing you're most looking forward to in this month of December, which is full of both light and darkness. So, and then let's jump right in. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for today. And then I also want to say just logistics. If you could all mute, please. You're welcome to leave your cameras on. That's, we welcome this to feel as though Rob is talking to people, not just circles, but I'm sure we're all used to it by now. But we do ask you to mute. I will be monitoring the chat. So I know it's very important sometimes to be able to ask your question while the slide is on the screen. I will be delaying issuing those questions to Rob until the end. We also give you an opportunity at the end of the presentation to come off mute if you so desire. Just remember the meeting is being recorded, but I'm happy to ask those questions for you. So go ahead and be very active within the chat, and I'll make sure they get in front of everybody at some point during the presentation, probably after. So let's introduce Rob. So Rob graduated in civil engineering from the University of Wollongong, Australia. He spent the first 10 years as design and project engineer for a private engineering consulting firm, gaining experience and expanding his knowledge of the industry in a wide variety of civil and stormwater engineering design projects for both private and public clients throughout New England. In 2014, Rob took an opportunity to leverage his experience in innovative stormwater and green infrastructure treatment systems and transitioned from consulting to the product, solution, and innovation space within our industry. Rob now serves with Ferguson Enterprises, who recently acquired ACF Environmental, where Rob was employed since 2015, as the National Manager of Urban Green Infrastructure, where he supports engineers, landscape architects, and designers on site development, green infrastructure systems, and overcoming their design and permitting challenges with a suite of innovative solutions. He is a registered professional engineer in Maine and Pennsylvania. He is a Maine DEP certified stormwater inspector, an ASCE member, a master gardener, my favorite, and an entrepreneur. Rob lives in Gorham. Might have messed that up. He lives in Maine, and he lives there with his wife, Jessie, and 4 children. And we welcome him today to discuss the survey that he conducted and the results that he got. So Rob, jump on in and take over. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, Annie. Appreciate that introduction. It's quite a mouthful, but I appreciate you working through it with some tough words there. University of Wollongong, town of Gorham, there's some tough ones in there. So thank you so much for having me. I'm absolutely thrilled to be with this group this morning, and the turnout here is awesome. A lot of familiar faces, a lot of familiar names, and a couple of new folks too. So if I haven't met you before, special welcome to you. And I'm really stoked to spend the next hour with you kind of going through a little bit of research I did earlier in the year to try to unpack some of the challenges and shortcomings in this crazy world of urban green infrastructure. A little bit background just to dive in a little bit beyond what Annie had there as well. Like was mentioned, I worked in consulting for 10 years. So I worked on the site design side, did a lot of stormwater stuff, a lot on commercial projects and lake watershed improvement projects, those types of things. And then the last 8 years, now 8, used to be 7, this is, I guess, a slightly older slide now, have worked on the engineered solution side of things. So products, solutions, new innovations, essentially supporting engineers, landscape architects. And now we've really seen this shift, and a lot of my focus has been working more with municipalities and looking at these municipal-wide or city-scale green infrastructure programs and sort of seeing where we can help solve some challenges there. So I did that with ACF Environmental, and now, as Annie mentioned, we were acquired almost a year ago by Ferguson Waterworks, and kind of doing that more on a national scale. I also do a lot of inspections, so it's not all about getting something in the ground and moving on. I go and look at a lot of these sites after the fact. So I spend my spare time, which is very little, on the weekends, sometimes looking at BMPs that have been put in the ground and seeing how they're performing over time. That's through a little subsidiary company I have called Northeast Stormwater Services. And as all cool kids do, if you want to be cool, you got to develop a vlog or a YouTube channel. So I have a little YouTube channel called Lidbit, and you can check that out. And I developed that specifically to say, okay, beyond that day one installation point, how do these systems work? Whether it's wet, whether it's dry, whatever it may be, what do they look like? Are they functioning well? What are we learning? And so if you're really bored and want to become my 53rd or 54th follower, that's over a course of 2 years. So I'm really living the YouTube dream at this point. You can check that out at some point. But when you think about all these different pieces, I've had this opportunity to design and see and observe a lot of the challenges that go beyond the typical engineering plan. That's what I love about my diverse background. Did the engineering thing for 10 years in consulting, designed a lot of plans, sort of separate from the long-term implications and maintenance. Now I'm sort of on the other side looking back and saying, oh man, if I was an engineer now today, I'd probably operate very differently. And hopefully you'll see some of those pieces today. So like was mentioned, I was with ACF East Coast, now part of this national monster called Ferguson Waterworks. And what was really exciting when we got acquired by Ferguson was this commitment from Ferguson to invest in sustainability, clean water, these green infrastructure type pieces. And so it's been really kind of cool to see that be elevated within a massive company that has 27,000 associates, but green infrastructure and that initiative that I get to lead becoming something that's being recognized. So that's just kind of good to see on that product side of things. Why do I do what I do? Pre losing my COVID beard, this is what I looked like earlier this summer. But this is my wife and my 4 kids. I'm passionate about protecting natural resources, and although I've had different roles and hats over the years, for me, the role I'm in right now, working with municipalities and cities doing this green infrastructure stuff, for me, gives me the best opportunity to, I think, to impact natural resources to the maximum extent possible. So that's kind of where it is, and that's my why. When you get beyond the family themselves, we just have so many natural resources that we need to protect. It's almost 50 years since the Clean Water Act, and the question is, have we got our act together? Are we at where we need to be? And we're really just starting to scratch the surface. And so the point of this presentation is to share some research I did that really highlights some successes, but then also some shortcomings in the process. So I work with a lot of different solutions in this space. The good thing is today we're not talking about products or solutions. We're talking about impact and natural resources. And no matter where you go, every city, every town is dipping their toes in this green infrastructure space. Some have been doing it for many, many years, like New York City and Philadelphia. Others have been slow and steady to adopt, like in the Pittsburgh area, great set of demonstration projects. And like Annie said, now it's kind of beyond that point. It's that time to really go and kind of push this stuff forward. But no matter where you go, everyone's kind of got their different take on it. Some are more focused on water quality, some are more focused on water quantity, probably water quantity being the more popular option. And everyone has different expressions of what that is going to look like. And the early adopters have learned a lot. Someone's joining. It's a nice announcement. Welcome to that participant. But when you get into these urban settings, there are these different complexities, right? We're dealing with tighter spaces. We're working around existing infrastructure. Construction may be affecting local business if we're in a sort of a streetscape application. And there's the need not to just throw it in the ground and say, boom, our work is done, let's move on, but actually monitor it, maintain it, see how it's performing over time to make sure we're not just spending a ton of money putting stuff in the ground to check a box, but it's actually having a positive impact on the natural resources that are downstream. Then the challenge of green infrastructure specifically, we're trying to get functional stormwater systems, but then there's a high expectation for them to look good as well. So planted systems and pavers and all these different things, this is a tough sort of balance to get right. And this is where we need a civil engineer and a landscape architect to be linked and working together. And what I've also noticed is there's kind of the research bucket, there's the design bucket, then there's the maintenance bucket. And it seems like in general, a lot of times those are working somewhat mutually exclusively from each other. And if that's the case, we're not taking what we learn in the maintenance space and bringing it back to what do we need to research next, or how are we impacting our designs as we move forward. And we'll touch on some of that today. So I work with a suite of solutions really to overcome a lot of those challenges. Recently added the word resiliency and climate change to this list. This is something that's becoming a bigger issue, specifically on the municipal side. Looking at a lot of undersized municipal stormwater BMPs that can't handle the kind of rainfall events and the intensities that we get today, and we're having to make adjustments to those. But I'd say one of the biggest challenges that we've sort of had to really dive into is the need for better pre-treatment. So we can put in the most amazing bioretention, the most amazing, ponds in the world, but if there's nothing there to protect that system, not only do they end up not looking great, but maintenance becomes very expensive and time consuming. So we're seeing a lot of cities shift to, including Pittsburgh, and I really enjoyed the presentation from Ryan Quinn and Anna Flores at Three Rivers, where they're talking about, okay, stepping back, okay, we've got to do a better job protecting these things, whether it's curb line filters and screens and things like that, so that we can have better outcomes and make our maintenance budgets a little more palatable. Anyway, so out of all these different things I've seen, people I've visited, engineers I've worked with, plans I've worked on myself, cities I've engaged with, I've kind of identified some shortcomings. They're not very amazing shortcomings that I've seen, but a couple of things I started to see trends with. A lack of interaction between owner and designer, specifically when it comes to maintenance and long-term needs for that piece. Interactions between design teams, so design team members, so civil engineers working mutually exclusively from landscape architects or the urban planning side, or not folding in some of the social or community pieces that need to be part of that process. Quality bid documents, we're seeing across the country a lot of 30 to 50% drawings hitting the street for bidding. Well, those plans don't have the detail needed to get successful projects, and when they don't have the detail needed, then they usually the quotes come in at a lower price than what's actually needed to fund the job, and then the job gets funded and there's not enough money to actually get what you want, and it starts to unravel fairly quickly. Lack of oversight, so no one's out in the field, and then we come out at the end of the job, point the finger and say, oh, you didn't get this right, you need to dig that up, do that again. The contractor's like, where were you? Like, I was here for 2 months, where were you? We could have worked on this together, right? So we miss out on some of that collaboration. And then, of course, one of the biggest challenges of just identifying and following through on post-construction maintenance protocols, which we'll talk about a bunch today. I think historically, as in the design community, I know a lot of folks on the call today are from that group, so that's kind of where I'm going to target my conversation today, is that we've looked at this process as a one-way street. We have design, we go into permitting, bidding, installation, and then maintenance, and then it's kind of like the end, right? But if that's the end, how are we learning from what we see in the field, right? So I think there needs to be this reconfiguration of things where we get into more of a loop, and we have that maintenance, that voice of maintenance impacting design. And I've seen that work really well in areas like Philadelphia, very strong focus on maintenance and learnings from that coming back to the front end. I had a great conversation with some folks from PwSA earlier in the week who were talking about this idea of maintenance being part of the planning process. Such a cool concept, such an important process for us to make sure that what we're putting on plans and what we're designing is being done with maintenance in mind. So all of that said, I kind of kept seeing these things and I'm like, are these really shortcomings? Am I misreading the audience? What are we doing? Well, what do I want to do? I want to survey folks, right? So I said, I'm sick of going out and seeing these green infrastructure systems that probably don't look particularly great to the general public. Obviously, this one, not the greatest looking rain garden. This one was a civil engineering masterpiece where we had a perfectly rectangular rain garden with one plant species in perfect rows and lines. Boom, civil engineering masterpiece. I'm one, I get it. I see the beauty there. Trust me, a 90-degree corner is far better than some kind of curve. Or this one where plants were excluded and we just bulked up the riprap a little bit, right? These are challenges. Or trash, debris. Ooh, are we planting trees just in holes? Are we providing environments for them to thrive? All these shortcomings that all come back to, I think, some pitfalls in the whole collaboration process on the front end. So that's not me, but could be me as a response to some of these things. So the survey was really created really, late one night, as many crazy surveys begin. And the goal was really to try to get some useful feedback from the design community to sort of confirm or maybe deny some of the thoughts I was starting to see or patterns I was starting to see out there. I got a great response from designers. Representing people from all over the country, predominantly on the East Coast. And I thank you for those who are on this call who participated in the survey. And I'll be honest, as we go through one by one today, the questions aren't perfect, and the answer options I provided were fairly simple. And if I was to go back in time, I'd probably refine some bits and pieces. But the goal was basically to address some questions about the design process, construction, maintenance, and then the overall connectivity between those pieces, and hopefully have the results shed some light on some things that we as designers need to think a little bit more about when we're engaging in these types of projects. Now, not to kind of, share the conclusions before we get started, but it confirmed a lot of things that I was expecting, but I was hoping weren't true, if that makes sense. I was kind of hoping the data would restore some faith in the process, and unfortunately it confirmed a few things. But regardless, I think as we go through this survey today, question and answer one by one, I'm going to work through it all with you guys. You'll start to see where there's parts, in your area of influence or your specific function at your company or your municipality, wherever you may be, where you can kind of step forward and say, hey, you know what? Maybe we need to step back a little bit and think a little bit more about this process before we dive into the next one. So we're going to go through one by one. Like Annie mentioned, if you have questions, put them in the chat box, and we'll kind of see how it goes. So the first few we'll buzz through fairly quickly. These were kind of qualifying questions. And then we get to some more nitty-gritty stuff at the end. Question one was, what's your email address? So I didn't feel like that was really relevant, sharing everybody's email address. So question two was, are you a civil engineer, B, landscape architect, municipal planner, or other? Pretty big turnout from the civil engineering population, which I was a little bummed about. I was hoping to get a little bit more landscape architect wedge in there. But regardless, what I'm starting to see is landscape architects driving more of the planning process for a lot of these green infrastructure projects, which is great. So there needs to be that. And hopefully, if I was to do this again next year, we'd start to see that pie chart open up a little bit. But regardless, that's kind of the mix of people, just so you know who we have on this in terms of their professional duties. What state are most of your design projects in? People had a bit of trouble following the directions on how to enter this answer. But the reality is, if you look from this, a lot of people from many states, a lot in New England, a lot in PA, which is where I've done a fair bit of work. Got some good following from Florida, some of the Carolinas, things like that. And a little bit as we head further to the west, mostly East Coast response. And you'll see in a few questions, a little more fixed to the north because there's a few questions about winter. And if you live in the south at this time of year, you're cheering. How many years of experience do you have? 0 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15, and more than 15 years. These are pretty typical kind of buckets for folks, depending on where you're at, sort of design engineer, project engineer, maybe more of a sort of a senior manager. Interestingly, a lot of folks who dived in here, more than half, had over 15 years of experience. So I thought that was kind of interesting, a nice spread of folks, honestly. But knowing that we have folks, 50% of respondents, folks have been around really since sort of green infrastructure became like a cool, trendy word, and some of these programs became adopted. So they've seen some of the evolution of these programs. So that's that in terms of the spread of experience. Question 5 was, are your design projects for public, private, or some of both? Probably as could be expected here, over 60% of folks were in the sum of both, which is what we see. We see a lot of municipalities or utility districts retaining the services of a, private civil firm or private landscape firm to perform the design services, even if it is a public project. And so regardless of whether we're at the local Dollar General or in the street, it could well be the same engineer working on both of those, or the same landscape architect trying to solve those challenges. Obviously, a little void of landscape architecture in this one. What's the goal of your GSI design? Is it water quantity? Is it water quality? Is it both? Or is that not really your focus? Is it just about street beautification? Here we have actually something that I expected. This was a little unexpected, I would say. So based on a lot of the programs being primarily volume focused, I thought there would have been a bigger wedge here in the blue. But interesting to see that well over 3/4 of the goals of these projects include both treating or filtering water as well as managing the volume piece. So that I found actually kind of interesting. And I think one person here pulled out the street beautification, so representing in the green quarter. Question 7. For water quality projects, what pollutants are you mostly designing to treat? So is it just trash and debris? Is it TSS? Is it TSS plus nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, heavy metals, bacteria? The spread here was pretty interesting and probably to be expected too. So we're seeing that shift over the last 5 or 6 years from these states and programs that are mostly focused on TSS to saying, no, we actually need to talk about phosphorus in lake watersheds. We need to talk about nitrogen in tidally influenced watersheds. So that was interesting. And I love the fact that there was this little wedge carved out for bacteria here in purple. We've seen that evolution of TSS to nutrients. But now we're seeing, whether it's on the West Coast or in a lot of coastal watersheds, the need for bacteria treatment. We're seeing those bacteria counts getting up there in stormwater, creating beach closures and things like that. And there's various technology companies that are starting to now build systems that are focused on bacteria. I would expect that in a year or two, if we were to redo this survey, that purple wedge would start to open up a fair bit, because bacteria, a lot of the plans I see or environmental studies I see out there will talk about two issues are impervious area, and then quite a few now on the coastal sides are bacteria. And I don't think a lot of people know how to manage the bacteria part of that. So I know there's a few folks on the call from Fabco today who make a couple of products in that space. Question 8. Are you, this is like a one I was really nervous about. Are you passionate about the connection between your design work and defending downstream natural resources? Yes, I am. Kinda, or nah, it's just what I do for a job. A little bit of honesty here in the yellow segment, right? But this is actually pretty cool. 2/3 of people, almost on the dot, passionate about that. I don't know what that looks like. Would they go down like, honey, I can't tell you what I did today. Like, I designed a rain garden. I don't know where the passion goes to. But the good thing is that there's a connection there, because if there is no connection, we're never going to fully uncover the triple line co-benefits, triple bottom line co-benefits of green infrastructure, because we miss out on a lot of those social and community impacts, because it's not even affecting us as humans. So there's our hero right beside the lake, excited about what just happened and the nearest upstream green infrastructure project. Question 9, so going into those triple bottom line co-benefits. Do you believe that your designs connect with the triple bottom line co-benefits of GSI? And these are described in many different ways from one place to the next, but usually that, in sort of the environmental category, that's usually kind of an easy one to do, because you're like, yeah, well, we're filtering water, that's boom. But then the social, the financial benefits, like how are those pieces being communicated? Sometimes is probably a fair answer here, so if you take the sometimes and the guess I don't think about this, you get to about 2/3 of people aren't really thinking about that. I think this is something we have to address. If 2/3 of folks aren't recognizing, okay, how is what I'm doing today connecting with these other elements, the social benefits, the community benefits, the potential long-term financial benefits for my developer, green infrastructure won't necessarily seem as advantageous to folks. And so we need to keep working out ways to share those and leverage those. And it might seem like, oh, I'm just designing a rain garden, like, let me be. But think about how in those moments, whether that's educational placards, whether that's engaging public, whatever it may be, that we can get those things going so that all those things can come together and we can have, exciting, well-sited, located places that are meeting places, that places people want to go to, as opposed to this guy who's having the worst December ever. If he was to fill out Annie's question in the chat box, December is just miserable because he's dealing with a clogged up rain garden. And everyone looks at this and says, what did the contractor do? I don't know if that's the right question to ask. Question 10. How often is the capacity of the practices you design oversized to address resiliency? Always, sometimes, never. This one was kind of interesting. Sometimes was actually bigger than I thought. I had a feeling that it was going to be still more in the never category. But regardless, if we add half of the sometimes, so we say we take 35% there, add that to the never, close to half of the respondents aren't thinking about the need to take maximum advantage of the space we have for storage for future issues, right? So trying to work out ways to maximize storage so we don't have these issues with these types of rainfall events, the frequency, the intensity that we have. And resiliency seems to be a big buzzword at a lot of conferences and seminars these days. And we're seeing a push on the funding side as well as the implementation to say, okay, yeah, we could fit, 100 cubic feet of water in the ground here. But you know what, for an incremental increase, a small incremental increase in money, we could maybe store twice that amount. And I know AKRF did a really interesting study that Tom Bertroni presented early in the year for PWSA specifically to talk about how if you double the size of a system, it doesn't necessarily double the cost of the system. That's something we have to keep thinking about in terms of if we're going to dig a hole, that's the best time to do the most we can possibly do with that hole before we move on. Question 11. Do you include innovative and proprietary practices in your design? This was kind of a curious one for me. I'm in that innovative proprietary practice space. So is it always? Is it sometimes when traditional practices aren't feasible? Or is it never? Great answer here. Obviously, we've got a few folks who use them all the time. 85%, I think this is a perfect space to be. It's folks saying, okay, I'm going to evaluate the traditional practices. I'm going to see what I can do. But I know that if I can't get those to work, I have other alternatives I can go to. I was encouraged to see only a very small portion of people say never on that. That was a good one. There are many things obviously out there for all kinds of different things: space efficient rain gardens, filters, cartridges, screening devices, different storage devices, chambers, tanks, all kinds of things that can be used, again, to try to optimize design, especially when space is tight. Question 12, do you research new design approaches in GSI or stick to what you have used in the past? Always look for new approaches, sometimes look for new options, but generally stick to what I've used, or never use new approaches, never. Again, pretty encouraging here. The nevers were a very small sliver, and I'm hoping that really should be zero, right? You've always got to be adapting to things and new things that are out there and things that are changing. So I was pretty encouraged here. You take half of the sometimes, that's about 30, add that to the 37% of the always. You've got about 2/3 of folks now who are looking at new approaches. I think, honestly, we really want to see that be 100% looking for new approaches, because we have to look at what's out there, study the projects that are around us, different cities, what they're doing, learn from those, and fold them in so we don't get stuck with the same design manual 10 years later and wonder why we aren't improving our outcomes. So think about trying something new. Question 13, do the civil engineer and landscape architect collaborate and work together in your designs? This is one I was really curious about as well. Do they always work together well or collaborate? Sometimes or never? Some truth here, we got 8% in the never. That's not a good place to be. But this is a little unsettling for me. Again, if we look at the sometimes, we're going to split that in half. So it's about 30%. We add that to the never. We're saying that around 40% of the time, we're not collaborating well between the civil and the landscape architect. To me, that's a major flaw in the process, because especially when we get to surface green infrastructure, we're thinking of plantings and things like that, right? We don't want the civil engineering masterpieces that I was talking about earlier. We need to make sure these systems, whether it's plant selection, whether it's plant location, whether it's shape, size, dynamics of the system, whatever it may be, both parties need to be involved. So we've got the functional part and the aesthetic part, or the feature part. And I criticized these publicly earlier. I'm sure I've designed things that look exactly like this in my design past. But then on the other side, landscape architects, maybe have too many plant species, or they're too close together. And there's kind of this happy medium between these two approaches, where maybe you have, 3 or 4 plant species that have a certain amount of spacing between them. Because the key thought is, when maintenance crews come out to look at these things, they need to be able to determine what's a weed and what's a plant, what's an invasive and what's not, and be able to call things out accordingly. If there's confusion, they'll either leave it to just overgrow or deadhead the entire thing, and that's not really what we want to see as well. So it's really important that these groups are working together. And I know a lot of firms now are starting to fold both groups into one firm, so you can kind of work collaboratively in that same office. I think it's fantastic. A lot of firms still sub one or the other part out to each other. This is something we have to really get resolved, because the aesthetics, the public opinion is often heavily tied to the way these things look. Question 14, is pre-treatment included in all of your GSI practice designs? Always, most of the time, rarely, or never. So, it's somewhat encouraging, but again, if we look at splitting the most of the time in half, that gets us 25%. We add that to the rarely, it means 50% of the time we're not folding pre-treatment in. I would say, out of all the programs I get to kind of drop in on and see and kind of work with, the lack of pre-treatment is the biggest contributor to complex and expensive and time-consuming maintenance. I'd say that's the number one thing. The work I've got to do in New York, the work I've got to do in Philly, a lot of the conversations that we have internally with PWSA is all about improving the filters and screens upstream of these systems. And there's a number of devices, like this is one we use a ton. It's called the Rain Guardian, but this is not about the product. But 4 or 5 years ago, I would design this rain garden right here with just a little opening with some riprap. And the rain garden would get absolutely smashed. You put in something simple like this. This is a system that hasn't had its mulch replaced in a couple of years. The plants are still thriving. There's seasonal color, these types of things. These sorts of devices have become no-brainers. And I know from PwSA standpoint, they've kind of discovered those things too and have started adopting these types of units. Even things like filter bags and screens that can be put in inlets. There's simple things we can do to make maintenance easier and lower in cost. And if maintenance is easier and lower in cost, the chances of it happening will go up substantially. So we've got to be thinking about pre-treatment. The reason we don't think about pre-treatment is it's generally not regulatorily driven. So it's usually sort of an option, like good practice. Hopefully my owner's cool with paying a little bit of money for that. We've really got to look at ways when we're building low impact development manuals, green infrastructure design guides, saying, you know what, pre-treatment's required because we need these systems to work beyond year one, beyond year two. And we need maintenance to be easy, that a qualified contractor can just pop through, in this case, pop a grate, clean it out and move on, as opposed to much more complex fossicking of sediment and debris. This is a big one. Question 15, how is bypass of larger storms provided? No bypass is provided. The systems spill back into the street and travel down to the next inlet, or internal bypass is provided. This one was pretty encouraging. So most folks are realizing now that the need to have some kind of internal bypass makes a lot of sense. So usually that's some kind of domed overflow, which helps do that rather than it just spilling out wherever it wants to go. Or when it spills back onto the street, functionally that can make sense to go into a downstream inlet, but public perception can be confusing there where they think, oh, this rain garden's failed. Well, no, it's actually at its maximum capacity. And now it's heading down the curb. That can look a little odd. And especially where we have winter climates, icing along curb lines, we want to try to keep things internal to the system. But when we put in these domed overflows, they can also turn into mulch cocoons or whatever we want to call them, where floatables and things like that get to this kind of overflow. This is a challenge because a lot of states and a lot of cities design with very small diameter pipes downstream of these systems. So there's some great options out there. We actually can deploy a filter bag in these. This is something that PwSA does routinely. Philly does the same thing with Philadelphia Water Department. This is actually a really nice little retrofittable device that, again, my friends from Fabco on the line actually make. And what's kind of nice here, it's an expanding ring. So it goes into the structure. You can kind of expand it out so it presses against the wall. That becomes the mounting ring for the bag versus hardware going through that. But despite that, this allows you a place to collect that mulch, that trash, and again, makes maintenance easier. So it's good for that kind of bypass protection. And we're seeing a lot of cities line up to say, hey, you know what? That's not a bad idea to add. Question 16. So we're past the halfway mark. Yes. Do you design with permeable surfaces? Often, sometimes, or never. All right, so this was kind of an interesting one. 70% said sometimes. So if we split that in half, we call that 35%. We add that to the nevers. About half folks don't, I guess, entertain permeable surfaces in their designs. Kind of interesting because it's a pretty popular way, especially when we have, shallow groundwater, not a lot of vertical room to work with to get water into the ground. I think the challenge is a lot of the early types of systems that came out with permeable surfaces maybe don't hold up in kind of the winter type areas, whether it's snow, whether it's sand, salt, all those types of things. So I think a lot of those, early products like just straight up porous asphalt and things like that have maybe jaded our interest in doing some of this over large areas. So let's dive a little bit deeper. If you do design with permeable surfaces, what do you mostly design with? Porous asphalt, porous concrete, permeable pavers, stone-filled grid systems, or like, no, I just told you on the last question, I don't design with permeable surfaces. So there's our 18% just holding true on the I don't use them. But interestingly, about half the folks looking at permeable pavers, which I think is pretty typical. You get some aesthetics out of it. Generally, you can do them in small areas versus porous asphalt that you need to do over larger areas. Interestingly, I co-presented in a presentation in New England a few weeks ago where UNH was sharing some of their research on porous asphalt. And there was also a consultant who does a lot of work with porous asphalt who was talking about their experience. And the consultant was saying that porous asphalt mostly, depending on where you're located regionally, generally only makes sense if you're doing even as little as an acre. So an acre or more of porous asphalt. is where you kind of hit that threshold where it makes sense for the plant to make it, where the QA/QC is in place to get a good mix and good placement, oversight, all those things. I would say maybe half an acre or more, but this particular consultant said an acre or more. So then when it comes to these smaller sites, these small retrofits or on-street parking or whatever it may be, that's, I think, why the pavers make sense, because you can do one paver or however many you want. The other thing that was interesting from UNH's study on porous asphalt was they found that even with routine maintenance, by the 10-year mark, all of their permeable asphalt had become impermeable, even with routine maintenance. So by that 10-year mark, it was no longer taking water through. They also found when they did test bits that the only thing that was clogged was the porous asphalt itself. The stone beneath was clean, the underdrain was clean, all those things. It was purely a clogging of the surface and an inability to rejuvenate it without digging it up. I thought that was kind of interesting. So a lot of the work I do is with permeable pavers, but even beyond just general permeable pavers, there are open joint permeable paver systems out there that don't even put aggregate infill, so you get really rapid transfer through, really low maintenance. So keep an eye, if you're kind of a skeptic on permeable surfaces, take a look at some of the newer innovations. The only concern in winter climates with permeable surfaces is that concrete and salt don't typically love each other. So you've got to think smart about where you're going to put it, or think smart about having a conversation with the developer, the owner, whoever your client is, to say, okay, we're thinking about permeable pavers here, but if we're going to do that, the winter maintenance plan has to adjust a little bit to make sure we protect it. Some owners might say, awesome, we can do that. We'll just do light sanding instead. Others might say, we can't control that. And then maybe the response to that is, okay, maybe permeable pavers aren't the best idea. There's also precast porous panels out there. And I think some folks have seen this product called Stormcrete that Porous Technologies make. Kind of overcomes the cast and play stuff, again, with a quantity piece, but also provides a product that can be picked up after the fact, cleaned, replaced if it needs to be, and put back, versus, again, that porous asphalt surface that once it's kind of clogged up, you can't really do much with it. So there are different things that are coming out that solve a lot of the challenges there. Question 18. If you don't design with permeable surfaces, okay, so let's get over to the nevers. What's the primary reason? Concern about maintenance, never considered designing with them, concern about performance during intense rain events. The company I work for doesn't allow me to use them. I heard that once, so I added it. And not applicable, I just told you I use them all the time. So as probably can be expected is that maintenance concern. Maybe that's budget, maybe that's equipment, maybe that's frequency, cost, who knows? But that's generally where we see the primary concern. And then again, obviously here, these folks saying, no, I'm good. I use them all the time. So maintenance is that big question around permeable surfaces. I think when it comes to these surfaces, you've just got to come up with a plan where you've got routine maintenance happening, vacuuming them out from time to time, not waiting till it gets to that point of failure, because that's where it becomes much harder and more expensive to rejuvenate them. And there's a number of companies that have a whole bunch of different vac heads out there to help with this process. Question 19, so getting into some plants piece now. Is plant selection a priority in your design? Always? Sometimes? Never. Brace yourself. Okay, so we're doing green infrastructure. And if we split the 58.6 in half, so it gives us about whatever that is, 29%, we add that to the nevers, we're about 40% of people who aren't prioritizing plant selection in a green infrastructure system. I think that's something we have to address, right? That gets back to the whole collaboration between civil and landscape architect. This is something that needs to become a priority because we need the plants to be sustainable. We need to be the right selection. We need to be the right, spacing, all these things. And if we're not doing the right plant selection, that's going to impact the way these systems need to be maintained as well. So that's something we have to be talking about and making sure that is a priority. And I know there's certain cities out there that have a specific planting guide. This is how you can do it. I know PG County in Maryland, when they were doing their P3, they had a very specific guide. So this is how every single one of their standard BMPs are going to be planted. So they had simplicity, consistency, and they knew kind of the obligations for each of their sites. Question 20, are there provisions in your specifications for plant establishment? So, hey, we've thrown the plants in the ground. Maybe they were the right plants, maybe they weren't. Always, sometimes never. Again, a little bit of a concern here, right? So sometimes I think this is one of the biggest gray areas. Once the plants are in, who's responsible for establishing them? Is the contractor on the hook for a year to come out and water and get them going, or replace plants that die off? Is that not spoken of? Is that something that, in the case of Pittsburgh, PWSA takes on, or in a private site development, the owner takes on, or the landscape contractor? This is a bit of a gray area. I know in New York City for many years, contractors who did right-of-way bioswales were on the hook for plants for 2 years, which I don't know that's very fair in a big city like that when you can't really control what comes in and who walks through and deposits what they deposit in these rain gardens. So this is something we have to just continue to build out in our specifications and planning. Question 21, are pre-bid meetings mandatory? Always, sometimes, never. Another one that for me personally, I think is a big shortcoming in a lot of our processes. So if we take half of this, 33%, we add it to the nevers, it's about 50% of time pre-bid meetings aren't mandatory. I think pre-bid meetings need to happen for one, but I think they need to be mandatory for the following reasons. This is what they used to look like when we gathered in person, just in case you forgot. When we have optional pre-bid meetings, you have some contractors who come to the meeting who learn about some of the specifics of the project. And usually because of that, they're like, okay, I've got to make sure I get, my soil from this place, or I've got to make sure I do this or that, or there's these extra things I've got to fold into my timeline or my sequencing. For the contractors who don't show up, they don't maybe get exposed to that information. And then of course, when the bids come in, the ones who went to that meeting often are actually at a disadvantage to getting the job because they know a little too much. And as a result, it kind of drives up their cost a little bit. And then you end up potentially having an unqualified contractor for the job. So pre-bid meetings should be mandatory. I feel like if we're going to get the good outcomes and make sure all of our bidders are qualified and know what the expectations are. And we also want to use these pre-bid meetings really effectively. I've been to many pre-bid meetings where it's just almost like a social function. It's like, hey, how you doing? This is great. Good luck with your bid. Looking forward to seeing your number. It's like, no, that's the time to specifically say, hey, this is what we want for plant establishment. This is the specifics of this. This is how we have to protect this. This is whatever it may be. I think it's going to those focused pre-bid meetings are going to overcome a lot of challenges during the project with regard to RFIs and questions and change orders and things like that. So just something to think about from me today. Question 22, are you involved in construction oversight of your projects? Always, most of the time, rarely, or never? Okay, so again here, we get, if we split the 57.5 of the most of the times, we get about 20 something, 28. We add that to the 31 of rarely, we've got well over half of folks aren't involved in construction oversight. I think this is again another shortfall. I know it's not budgeted for, and it's not like, if you were paid to go out as an engineer or landscape architect to inspect sites, you would. But I think this is a really important part. And I think also it helps establish good rapport with the contractors there as well, because you're linking arms and you're partnering with them as opposed to back at your desk designing the next project and then kind of coming out after the fact and being like, no, that's not what I intended to happen here. So it doesn't have to be the engineer of record. Could be the engineer of record. It could be the landscape architect of record. It could be the client's rep, a owner's rep. For some of our innovative systems, it's often good to have the innovative company out there because they know their systems better than the others. So it's, but you want to make sure that oversight is provided. And it's not to babysit the contractor. It's really to make sure we get good outcomes. Question 23, are the systems you design protected during construction? Always, most of the time, rarely, and never. Here we see most of the time and the rarely's equating to about 35%, 36% of folks. This is something that I see missed a lot. We see really elaborate erosion control plans, erosion control mats on 3-to-1 slopes and TRMs on 2-to-1 slopes and riprap on 1-to-1 slopes. So whatever it may be, a lot of folks on those silt sacks in the inlets, awesome. But what about the surface of the media itself? What's preventing those unvegetated slopes from sloughing down and impacting, say, the surface of a rain garden or a specific kind of media? Smaller footprint systems, you can put blankets over them just temporarily to cover that system and protect it while everything else becomes vegetated. I've also seen folks run silt fence around that, which works well, but silt fence can be difficult to remove sometimes. So you want to be careful at the end of the job. Now you've got everything established, and now you get in there and you start, ripping up the edge of the system. So you got to think smart about those. But I think having provisions for the phasing and protection of these systems, or saying, hey, you know what? This rain garden mix can't go in until certain other things are stabilized around the site. And again, I see these beautiful E&S plans, but they seem to not include specific notes about the green infrastructure systems themselves, even protecting permeable pavement so that sediment doesn't run on and clog the gaps during construction. That's not cool. Question 24, is construction phasing and coordination of trades reviewed during the design phase? This is a bit of a wild one, right? Always, sometimes, never. So are we thinking about how other trades are going to move through a site during a project, right? Coordination of trades. Again, if we add the nevers and the sometimes, we get over 60% or close to that of folks who aren't thinking through these things. This is really important because there can be a lot of I guess, issues that come up with these green infrastructure practices often relate to another trade coming into a site and not realizing what it was and setting up shop. I've got a couple of great photos of little biofilters we've done where the porta potty was set up on it, which is actually probably harmless in the grand scheme of things, but it just didn't look quite right. And I don't know they knew that they were setting up their porta potty on a beautiful new biofilter. Taking that a little further, does construction phasing and coordination of trades impact your BMP selection? Always, sometimes, or never. Here again, we see sometimes and nevers being the majority. This is a big challenge also. We had a project way back where this was an 8-story parking garage that was being built with a surface parking lot over here. And the designer actually originally had designed it with 5-foot diameter pipe that kind of was a subsurface storage system that went from this edge of the site all the way over to the train tracks. Got bid that permanent that way, bid that way, and then the GC said, "Hold on a second, we got to set up a crane, we got to bring in heavier vehicles that exceed HS25 load rating. We're going to crush that pipe system." And so we actually worked with them on that project to do a smaller footprint modular box system, the high void space, only because of the construction phase piece. After the project was done and the surface of the parking lot was completed, that 5-foot diameter pipe system would have been perfectly fine. But having a smaller footprint allowed that coordination to happen. So these are things we have to think about, how to protect those systems during construction and how to make it easy to assemble buildings and things like that when they're bringing in cranes and other crazy things. And we don't want to destroy the stormwater assets. Okay, we're getting closer to the end now. Question 26, after the project is complete, do you meet with your design team for project forensics to discuss what modifications need to be made for future projects? This was like one of the linchpin questions for me. Okay, finish a job. Are you pausing to learn from that and maybe adjust how you go about the next one, right? Always, hopefully that's a good part of the pie chart. Sometimes or never. And I gave everyone a little grace here. You know what? I need to move on to the next project. No time to pause. I get that. I wanted people to feel free to just acknowledge that, you know what? I can't stop. I got to keep going. This one's a bit of a tragic one, right? Nevers 36. We split the sometimes in half at about 27. We get 27 plus 36, which is like 63%. This is maybe one of the core challenges with some of the struggles we're having, right? The design community, which I'm part of, right? Design communities with civils, landscape architects, planners, even on the municipal side with internal staff. There's such a need to keep cranking out these projects that I'm not sure we pause to learn from what we've seen on the past project. And I get it. When I was working as a consulting engineer, I had no time to go out and look at these systems when it was raining or, in my quote spare time. Nowadays, I find myself on sites more so I can see some of that and hopefully share some of that information. But this is a big deal. We see green infrastructure manuals that are still current that have had no revision since 2010 or 2005. We've learned a lot since then, right? When we think about pre-treatment, when we think about bypass protection, when we think about all the different things that PWSA shared in their presentation at Three Rivers Wet Weather the other day, like the lessons learned, how are we taking those and folding them back into the planning process? Because there's that whole definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. That's kind of what's at stake here. And I think as designers and as stewards of the natural resources that we are in place to protect, we've got to pause. We've got to go out and look at them and say, you know what? I think I need to tweak that detail a little bit. I think we need to change the way we're doing that. I think we need to leave a little more space between the inlet point where the plants are because they're getting blown out or whatever it may be. We need to change our soil mix because it drains really well for 6 months, but then after that it doesn't. Whatever that may be, we've got to do that part. That is so important. And get out there in our little hazmat suits and start checking out what went wrong. Question 27, are the systems you design generally maintained to the level you were hoping for? Interesting. Always, most of the time, rarely, never. So we'll split the most of the times into half. We'll add that to the rarelys. That's 75% of people feel like these systems aren't maintained as well as they should be. That's probably honest. I mean, the reality is there's a lot of systems out there. When folks say, hey, I'd like to go out and see some of your biofilters or some of your paver systems. I'm like, oh, well, we don't want to go to that one. We don't want to go to that one. We don't want to go to that one. We'll go to this one, right? Because these other ones I know haven't been touched since they were put in 5 years ago. And guess what? You know, they're weedy messes. Who would have thunk it? And I see this kind of two very distinct groups here, right? When it comes to groups who are owning maintenance and budgeting for it, where you're out there, you have designated crews, and these systems end up looking really good. And then you have the other side of things where something goes in the ground day one, and then no one ever visits it again. And I don't see a lot in the middle. There's the ones that do maintain and the one that don't. There's very few in the middle. We need to get more of those don'ts getting into the do's, but that does come with a cost, right? So we have to be budgeting for that. This was an interesting project I saw in southern Florida a couple of weeks ago. The owner mentioned, an engineer mentioned that the town had tried out some green infrastructure, but it hadn't really been received that well. Well, I went out to look at them, and they clearly haven't been maintained. It was probably also on one of the scariest streets in the neighborhood. And I'm sure someone said, hey, this would be a great way to enhance and kind of bring up the community here by adding some green infrastructure. But I have a feeling on the street, the maintenance crews aren't too excited about hitting that street for maintenance regularly because it's a little bit dicey driving there. We've got to be thinking about these things. And you know, if the designers are saying, hey, they're not maintained to the level you're hoping for, we as the design community have to step up and say, hey, you know, we've got to do a better job communicating this message and making sure this is accounted for before we start digging holes and putting things in the ground. Question 28, how often do you discuss maintenance with your client? So now we'll put the lens back on us. We're saying it's not getting done, but are we discussing it? Always, sometimes, never. Always, 56% top marks, you know, but then we get to the sometimes and the nevers, it's still a decent enough portion of this result that says, okay, are we doing the best we possibly can to set our client up to know the expectations? Now, will the client want to hear it? Maybe not. So I realize that's part of it. Some people just want to, the stormwater design is just a means to the ends to getting a building built and starting to make money. I get it. But, you know, we've got to, this needs to be 100%. At least we've had that conversation. And then at least the listener has to react in some way, either to budget for it and get it done or to say, let's just see how it goes. Question 29. Do your clients budget for ongoing maintenance of GSI projects? Always, sometimes, never. So if we take the sometimes at about 34% and we add them to the nevers, that gets us right on 50%. So this again is something that we have to kind of look at and say, all right, 50% of the time, according to the data, right, we're not budgeting for maintenance. So if we're not budgeting for maintenance, it means we're not planning for maintenance. And we're not planning for maintenance, I guess we see a lot of people spending money on systems that aren't actually going to contribute to the improvement of the downstream water bodies. So again, this is something that we have to keep talking about. It's not about does the BMP fit on our plan or how much will it cost, but we need to fold in not just the the construction costs, but also the post-construction costs. And that is going to be a necessary piece, because if we don't budget for it, then when it comes time to do it, everyone's like, well, I don't have the money. Even like a homeowners association, right? They've got a very specific budget to cover their costs. If stormwater maintenance isn't part of that fee, then the condo association has no ability, or the homeowner association has no ability to lay out money to some maintenance crew to come in and inspect and maintain the system. So it has to be budgeted for. We have to communicate that. Question 30, which is the final one before we get on to our final general question, is does winter maintenance impact your BMP selection for a given site or location? Always, sometimes, never, or I'm that annoying person in December who lives in a warmer climate who doesn't deal with winter. So obviously most respondents have to deal with winter in some way. But is our BMP selection being impacted by that, right? Well, if we add the nevers to the sometimes, we get, again, close to 50%. I think this is something we have to think about too. Again, I talked about some of the concrete permeable pavers before and salt degrading those. So that's a winter maintenance element that we have to think about. Is that the right BMP, right? Or knowing that snow storage areas always somehow mysteriously end up being exactly where the bioretention system is, right? Are we planning for some of those things? So that's a conversation that needs to keep going on, because if you're in a winter climate, these BMPs are definitely dormant for a period of time or are working at a slower rate, and they also get hit a lot harder by some of the severity of the winter that we deal with. All right, so as we get towards wrapping it up, the final question I ask folks was a general question. It was a bonus question. And in Family Feud style, I'm going to kind of reveal some of the answers in terms of what the survey says. So the question was, what do you see as the biggest challenge facing GSI projects and programs today? And this was an open, short answer question, so people could actually kind of type out. There weren't options. This was like a freestyle. You tell me what you think. If I was doing this in public in front of you, or this, we'd have a little kind of, you could raise your hands and say what you think the answers are going to be. So maybe just take like 10 seconds in your head and think about, maybe jot down on a piece of paper what you think the survey is going to say. And I'm going to take it from lowest point value up to the most popular answer as we work through the board. So have a little thought. If you get it, if you get the top two, give yourself a pat on the back. If you don't have to confess to anybody. It's okay. So here we go. So the biggest challenges facing GSI. A couple of folks talked about geotechnical challenges. Great one. I'm actually surprised more people didn't. So whether it's poor soils, high groundwater, a lot of low impact development relies on infiltrating. And in a lot of areas up in the Northeast, that's not feasible, right? So poor soils, groundwater table, even challenges with construction associated with those soils. Two folks kind of touched on that. Resiliency. And this was not challenging the resiliency function of green infrastructure, actually proposing the idea that folks don't recognize the contribution that green stormwater infrastructure can make to the goals of resiliency. So I thought that was kind of an interesting kind of take on it. Moving up the board, installation. So just the whole construction side of things, and that comes back to qualified contractors and good specifications to make sure we get installations that work well. 7 folks talked about space. So again, and that's a big challenge, right? We want to do all this stuff, but we're in an aged city that has a ton of impervious area. Where do we fit these things? Where do we put them in locations that they're going to have the best impact? And we start to get some of the big ones. Knowledge gap. So I've summarized answers into these simple terms, so I've sort of taken a little bit of creative liberty there, but a lot of folks talked about this misunderstanding or lack of understanding of what GSI can bring, and it ties into some of those triple bottom line co-benefits and maintenance, installation, all those different pieces. So do we fully understand what we're getting into? The third one was regulations. Interestingly, most folks who spoke about regulations were more stating that the way a lot of these stormwater manuals are written, they don't necessarily have provisions for a lot of these green infrastructure type of approaches or BMPs or practices. And so really stating more that regulations need to evolve to fold more of these things in so that as cities or developers want to use them, they're not going to get caught up in the permitting process where folks say, oh, I don't really see where we have a rain garden here. I don't think we can do that, right? So it's bringing those manuals kind of up to a current status to incorporate those things in. And then the top 2, I'm guessing most of you probably would guess, they are cost and maintenance. And the 2 finished in the following order. So second on the list was maintenance. And the challenge really I think I covered in a lot of my questions, right? It's this lack of information conveyance. It's this lack of maintenance actually happening. It's the lack of budget for it. It's the perception that maintenance is going to be expensive. But I think often that perception or the question or the counter argument to that is compared to what, right? If you're doing nothing, sure, maintenance is free, right? But as soon as you put something in the ground, it needs maintenance. And everything needs maintenance, right? Cars, relationships, rain gardens, it's all the same thing. If you just let it sit, it's probably not going to go well for you moving down the road, right? Number 1, cost, right? Cost was 34. Now, this 34 people commented something to do with cost. And again, what I thought interesting was people weren't saying, oh, it's too expensive. It was more to do with folks don't understand the financial benefits of these systems, right? And a lot of that ties into some of those co-benefits too. So I was encouraged by that. I thought people might say, oh, it's just too expensive. No one wants to do it. It's like, no. It's people don't understand the financial benefits of this. And again, compared to what, right? Doing nothing costs you nothing, sure. But doing something is going to cost you something. So we got to look at kind of keep it apples to apples and make sure that it's a fair argument. So hopefully that's interesting you and hopefully not really surprising. These are the challenges that we face today. And for everyone on the call today, these are the things that we need to all work together to try to overcome. So a couple of take-home messages. You probably all had different questions that stood out to you, some that may have rubbed you the wrong way, some that may have inspired you, who knows. But for me, a couple of things to think about. We need to be thinking about ways to better collaborate from design all the way through to post-installation maintenance, and bring that conversation back to design when we kind of learn things in the field. We need to pause and take what we're learning in the field and modify, adapt, and revise our approaches for more sustainable outcomes. And what I'm finding for the various areas I get to visit and participate in is that pre-treatment is a really big part of that. So if you're currently today working on a rain garden, which has a curb inlet with just a little riprap, hit the pause button and think about some pre-treatment options. We need to consider using new approaches and solutions to achieve goals. And I think, again, our regulations have to evolve to support those things so that there's not a sort of a time gap or regulatory hurdle with being able to try new things. We need to consider ways to leverage the triple bottom line co-benefits of GSI. So I think often, again, I think the design community hasn't really had to be responsible for some of those pieces, whether it's the financial or the social co-benefits, mostly focused on the environmental pieces. But who else is taking control of that, right? So as we look to work with our clients, our developers, whether that's municipal, whether that's public, private, whatever it may be, we got to think of simple ways to do that. Providing areas for education, providing areas for benches and seats and different things, having honest conversations about maintenance. And I think we can come up with some really interesting designs. And honestly, if you're a design firm looking to kind of emerge as someone that's sort of a leader in the space or differentiate your services from the next, I think these are great things to be able to bring forward and say, hey, look, we have a collaborative approach. We recognize that there's a ton of co-benefits for these types of projects. We want to help you with that. I think certain audiences are going to say, bam, I want to work with you. We need to communicate maintenance obligations more clearly and make sure that maintenance is happening. That's an obvious one, right? That's probably the biggest shortfall, just throwing it in the ground, checking a box and feeling like, boom, we used our grant money, let's move on. No, we've got to fold the maintenance piece into that. And then to do with that, folding budget in. And I see a lot of grant projects, 319s and other things that are out there, even resiliency grants that are all about capital costs and have nothing to do with maintenance, not even defining responsibility of maintenance. And that can get a little frustrating. So keep an eye out for those types of things. And then, when we come to those kind of top things on the board I showed, we got to work together to overcome those biggest challenges, right? Cost and maintenance, that's on our shoulders to help kind of obliterate those concerns and make sure we can move forward and take what we've learned, put all these things into our planning process and get better outcomes. If you want to complete the survey, this is a really ridiculous link, but we can post that separately. I know that Annie had provided that link in the invitation, and I think a handful of people actually completed it. So thank you for that, including a couple of landscape architects. Yes, kind of trying to beef up that segment of the survey. So feel free to do that. I'm going to hopefully do this again in another 18 months and see how the results change. But apart from that, I think I'm right at my hour. I thank you for listening to this presentation. Hopefully some of this was interesting to you. If you want to follow up with me at any point for any reason, reach out to me. My contact information is on the board. And as you can probably tell, I love talking about this stuff. And I'm really excited to see us kind of get our act together as a national or international design community and say, okay, sometimes thinking globally can be a little overwhelming, but how can I act locally in my community or my zone of influence or sphere of influence and help contribute to the protection of these resources to keep them fishable, swimmable, and all those other things that come along with the beauty that we've been gifted. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Rob. I getting a little feedback. I'm sorry about that. Anyway, I really appreciated the presentation. I did feel a little like a schoolgirl being scolded a bit because I do feel like, if you know me, my background isn't just 3 Rivers Hot Weather. I used to work and do a lot of green infrastructure installations at Jacobs Creek Watershed Association using 319 funding. And we were like right out of the door, early implementation, early demonstration projects, considered, a leader in the region and just throwing things in the ground. Boy, did we just do a lot of things that we would look back on now, right? I'll try to keep it positive. We'll look back on now and say, how are we going to retrofit those systems now that they're in the ground, they're there to meet the needs of tomorrow? So Rob, I really appreciated learning about all these things and thinking about the maintenance and the pros and cons and all of that aspect that that we're dealing with. So I had promised Rob that I was going to develop a couple questions myself, but the chat has been incredibly lively, and I'd really like to actually open it up. I saw some comments from John Buck. If you want to come off mute, if you'd like to share some of the comments that you had, I think it'd be great for them to keep in mind that because it's being recorded, people viewing this later won't be able to see some of the things you had to say in the chat. So it'd be great if you could share them with us if you're willing.
Well, thanks, Annie. Yeah, the idea of protecting installations as they're being built is tremendously important. I think there's often a shortfall in construction observation where a designer could intervene and say, hey, look, a bunch of silt just got dumped and sealed the soil surface. I think there are some things that we're not doing that we could be doing on sort of the above waterline parts of these infiltration-based systems, like using sod instead of erosion control blanket that would not just control erosion, but also provide some instant green. And, I know sod can be boring, but it can be a very effective filter, and you can diversify it later with plugs or plantings through it, live stakes, that sort of thing.
And everyone understands the maintenance of sod. We're all very familiar about how to maintain a good sod, right? So.
Right. I mean, you can ignore the mowing part. It's like the side slopes of a bioretention area.
I think just to comment on that, John, I think you make a great point. I actually do a presentation on protecting green infrastructure during construction, and I have a whole slide on that sort of options for stabilizing the slopes. And I think you're right. I think often we think, oh yeah, it's a 3-to-1 slope, we'll just throw some matting on it. But that's usually right at the end. Then we'll haphazardly seed it or hydroseed it, and it never takes the way we want it to. So sod is such a simple way to get that stuff stabilized. And even in some circumstances, that's not enough. And we see folks use like little riverstone or something like that to give that toe or slope that you refer to. That's a really critical zone. I think that's a good point.
Yeah, I would just throw this out. We talk about guidance documents that might be aging and maybe not aging gracefully. In Pennsylvania, we have guidance that says you're going to characterize the infiltration rates of the soils at the elevation that you intend to infiltrate. And then you're going to apply like a 2-time safety factor. And then you're going to use a geometric mean instead of an arithmetic mean. And you're kind of larding the calculation with conservatism. Now, this all assumes it gets built perfectly. But then those same guidelines are saying you're going to make it infiltrate between 24 and 72 hours. Well, if you already have thrown a 2-fold factor of safety in there, it might infiltrate faster than 24 hours. And so it's kind of, I think engineers, landscape architects, whoever is sealing the drawings have to really take control of the design, because they're going to get on the sharp edge of liability and assert themselves if they don't agree with the guidelines and justify those departures if that's the case. So in the green infrastructure I've monitored, it typically is overbuilt, and in looking at what's getting into the ground versus what's bypassing. So anyway, thanks for the opportunity, Annie.
No, thanks, John. And I know that Rob Zagraki, oh God, I'm going to mess up your, Rob Z. Zagraki, there we go, right? You had a couple comments in the chat. Did you want to jump in? I thought some of the things you said about how some of the survey things are a little deceiving just because some survey answers aren't able to account for, well, you don't throw a tree in the middle of porous pavers, so it might not be green. But I think I see Ron maybe had to step out at the hour. So my last question, or that I have, unless someone wants to jump in, I'm happy to have. Oh, he has no mic. So his comments are in the chat. If anyone would like to dig in on them, they're interesting as we evaluate both maintenance, soil samples. I laughed as I was reading some of them because it's really true. The analysis of your site before you're building them. At Jacobs Creek, we had this green infrastructure parking lot that we were going to put porous asphalt on, probably not in the size that would make it in like a cost-effective project. Oh, you learned a lot of lessons today. But when we were installing it, we did some core samples. We're like, oh, we're good to go. Then when we went to build, we discovered an entire wastewater treatment plant from, I don't even know, the 50s had been buried underneath it and was right in the middle where we were going to infiltrate. So, just gosh darn it, do we ever really, there's so much we have to learn about those types of things. And Rob was discussing some of those things in the chat. But my question to you, Rob Woodman, the presenter, so we've put a lot of green infrastructure in. Have you seen successful retrofits where we can go back and take these lessons learned and take, as you have described it, as forensics? So I really view GIN as the forensics maybe for all of us, right? So let's take this educational opportunity that we're using in this network and start doing the forensics necessary to be successful, just like you presented. Have you seen successful retrofits of us learning what we know and maybe applying it moving forward? But what do we do about everything that's behind?
Yeah, great question. A lot of it comes down to money, I think, that, again, if you're only budgeting for that initial get it in the ground, then you can come out and observe all the challenges in the world. If there's no budget to then go do any of that, then it makes it a little bit tricky, right? So I've seen on a larger scale, I've seen, I think, a pretty successful adoption of making adjustments in Philly, some of the assets there where, they've added bits and pieces retroactively, sometimes to demo it. And if it makes sense, then they'll use it as a standard design moving forward. I'm really encouraged in my discussions and some of the presentations I've listened to from PWSA with saying, okay, haven't done too many projects yet where they're too far down the line where changes can't be made. So I think, that, the inlet points to some of the rain gardens. I know they were sharing some of the lessons learned about placement of the media, which I have a number of questions about still, but there's a lot of different pieces there. So just the fact that there is that forensics happening is a good step. I'm always curious to see whether folks will say, all right, well, for the next one, we need to do this, or whether there'll actually be some funds there to actually go back and fix what's there, or that just becomes the learning model that, is going to slowly and steadily kind of die off from us. So I think the more assets you have, the harder it is. New York City with thousands and thousands of right-of-way bioswales, found that their inlet opening wasn't working well. That's a very difficult thing to go back now and retroactively fix. Whereas I think Pittsburgh is at a really nice critical point where there's been enough demo projects with a ton of variety of BNPs. I mean, really fantastic. It's not just one thing we're going to toss in everywhere. There's been a bunch of different approaches and styles. Hopefully now, and it seems like that's happening from speaking with Ryan and Beth and some of the others there, that now it's that point to say, okay, what have we learned? What do we need to do differently? And how do we bolster our specs moving forward? I haven't seen a lot of retroactive fixes though, honestly, unless something's like catastrophically bad. Like there was a rain garden in Philly that wasn't performing. It was, flooding every time a little rain came through. And so they actually cut out a small area and put in one of our focal point biofilters there to help it drain. But that was because there was, deleterious impacts to neighborhoods as opposed to just like, no, it's not performing the way we quite want it to. It usually takes that. I think DC water is the same. Like DC has a lot of trouble with their permeable alleys. And maintenance isn't very effective on some of their kind of sort of basic permeable pavers they use with aggregate infill. But it's only when you start getting complaints from neighbors about floodings and basements and things like that it really ups the ante from a PR standpoint. So yeah, we'll see. But I think Pittsburgh's really well seated to now go out and conquer the universe, so long as the funding continues to grow to support the maintenance that's needed to go with those.
Awesome. Well, that's not great news for some of the projects that were some of the leaders, but that means that, like I said, we can just learn from those examples. And some of the rain gardens I personally was involved in putting in the ground, luckily are in small town and rural areas that we can hopefully go back to and learn from, and aren't catastrophic failures for sure. They were
For sure.
very successful in their own right.
I think it's good
But,
to share those values. I think it's good to share those values too. I mean, for 2 years ago, I would have hesitated to bring someone to some rain gardens that we worked on that were completely filled with sediment and just had weeds, and you wouldn't even know a rain garden was there. Now I'm like, you know what? No, we're actually going to go there, because guess what wasn't there? There wasn't pre-treatment. No one's maintained it. This is what happens. It's not working. It's in permanent bypass and it looks ugly, you know? So that actually helps build a case for saying, you know what, pre-treatment actually makes sense. Look at these ones that have it. Look at the contrast between the two. You know, which way do you want to go, and how much money you're willing to spend on those little upgrades to get the right outcome. So
well, that was my question. I'd like to offer an opportunity for anyone to unmute and ask a question directly. I'd love to hear your voices and hear what you may have to ask so we can learn from each other. If everyone's feeling very shy, I understand it. We're all used to this environment now, but I think I won't keep forcing questions out of you all or asking Rob. I will just politely say thank you. Thanks for the great presentation. Like I said, it was illuminating. I also feel as though you were a call to action to Jen, right? If we need a space that allows us to pause and say what's working, how is it working. I understand that it may not be then within the project team, and it may not be able to directly alter and address the project that you had just completed, but maybe that's really where Gin and networks and water networks and collaboratories and collaborations are able to play an important role. And as you know, I have a strong background in nonprofits, and there's a lot of nonprofits that are working with all due diligence, hopefully to maybe where you in the consulting field and you in the design field and you as the engineers aren't given the grace of that space. Maybe that's where us nonprofits can really pick up and develop that that opportunity to reflect and grow, and also create the lesson learns and build the frequently asked questions that allow us to move forward. So I just want to thank Rob. I don't know if you saw it, but at the end of your presentation, many people used the clapping emoji. So your presentation was very well received. I also want to say I totally forgot at the beginning of this meeting, this is a topic that we're happy to offer PDHs for. So if you would like to receive a certificate from Three Rivers Wet Weather, verifying that you attended today, I can send them out to you. If you would just pop in the chat your name and PDHs, I will happily get that certificate to you. I'll reach out to those that left before now. I apologize. I was just too excited to learn today and forgot some of my responsibilities as a host. But I would like to wish everyone, whatever holidays you celebrate and however you spend your December, whether it's in the snow or it's with your family or it's far from here or it's sitting on your sofa, whether it's in front of a fire or it's, you know, watching your tree glitter, however it be, wherever it is, I hope it is peaceful and I hope it is beautiful. I look forward to being the program manager moving forward at Three Rivers and hoping Three Rivers Wet Weather can provide that forensic look into green infrastructure that we all need to be successful. So I thank you all for coming, and make sure you drop your name and PDHs in the comments and we'll get you those certificates. And I thank Rob, and I hope you have a great time in Australia. That's a little bit cooler than anything I know I'm doing, but everyone have a wonderful day and enjoy your Friday. Thanks, everybody.
thanks, Annie. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Annie. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.